This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar today. It's actually technically a GoToMeeting. I was telling people that we're using GoToMeeting instead of a webinar or Zoom because those only allow 100 participants. And we had over 100 people register and we have 114 people on right now. So what that means is that we need a lot of cooperation from you to turn off your mic and your webcam. If you don't, Nazifa is going to do that for you, and she's gonna help you to do that. But we wanted to start just by welcoming you here today to this webinar. But Nazifa is going to, my name is Melissa, I'll introduce myself in a second, but Nazifa is gonna start with a few logistics.
Yes, so once again, I am Nazif Zirzada. I'm the program coordinator here at Global Rights for Women. And just a couple of logistics, please, as you enter, make sure that your microphone is muted and your video is turned off. And please direct any questions or concerns you have to the chat box. Throughout the presentation, feel free to leave messages in there or send me an email. My email is in the chat box as well. And moderators will be taking questions throughout the PowerPoint from the chat box, and a recording of the presentation will be sent to you afterwards.
And then just one other thing, that's what just to remind people who came a little bit later that they do have the PowerPoint in their email from you, right?
Yes, you have received the PowerPoint from an email from me earlier.
Yeah, and the reason why we did that is we've had some issues, technical issues in the last few weeks when we've done this, where the computer freezes or glitches, and so sometimes we prevent that by turning off the share screen. That sometimes can help. So if we run into that issue, that's why we emailed it to you ahead of time. Okay. Nazifa, go ahead.
Yes, yeah, so just a little bit about Global Rights for Women. We work with leaders around the world to help advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence, and we do that through legal reform and institutional social change. And just a little heads up, I want to take this time to let everyone know about two upcoming webinars we have. And the next one we have is tomorrow from, I believe, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Central Time. And that one is on the court's response to violence against women during COVID-19. And the other one we have is on May 1st from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. Central Time. And that is a how-to on how to engage responsibly with perpetrators of domestic violence individually and also in a video conference software setting during COVID-19. And I will leave a link for where you can find more information on those trainings and webinars in the chat box. It's available on our website.
Great, thanks, Nazifa.
Yeah.
Then just, thank you. And then just the other thing just want to mention is that there are a number of partner agencies for this webinar today, and we want to make sure that we give a lot of credit to the European Network for the work with perpetrators of domestic violence. For those of you that were with us last week, they really inspired the work that we're talking with you about today. We took those guidelines and then worked to sort of adapt them and have you consider sort of some adaptations that we're going to talk with you about today. So we wouldn't be here without them doing that groundwork. And then John and I co-facilitate group through Pathways to Family Peace. That's part of the international exploratory study that John and I started in January of 2019 to see if perpetrator groups should be done through video conference software. So we started that study with two researchers in England, not knowing, of course, that any of this would happen. But we started that organization solely for the purpose of exploring whether this was a good idea. And then, of course, the organization that John works with, which is the Family Violence Project in Maine, and then Global Rights for Women, Nazifa's already talked about. So I'm going to hand it off to, it's one other thing I just want to say, this slide, there's a lot of small text in there. We just provide this to you because you have the PDF. These are the list of all the people who have contributed to the written document that will be emailed to you today. But we just wanted to publicly thank all these people who helped contribute to the written document. So you can see that in larger text in the PDF that was sent to you. But I'm going to hand it over to Juan Carlos.
Yes, thank you, Melissa, and good morning or afternoon to everybody. Seems like most folks are from the US, and but there are some people from other countries, so welcome. Before I get started, and my role here will be really a facilitator of the process, I would like to recognize Melissa because your leadership on this has been extraordinary. You really have stepped up to the plate at a time in which there's a lot of confusion, right, in the field because this is new for all of us. So please, I hope that you join me on a virtual applause to Melissa for her hard work here. And as Melissa mentioned, we have to recognize that this is something that we are all learning here together. We have a panel of really extraordinary leaders in the field. There were others that were commentators to the document. And again, Melissa, I think you have done a wonderful job and incorporated many voices of many people, which I know is not easy. But the truth is that we're all learning here in this process. So I actually will let the different panelists briefly introduce themselves. Melissa, you want to say something else about yourself? And I don't know if I mentioned that I work for Futures Without Violence. It's there.
Yeah, you did not. Yeah, no, just that my other roles, I'm the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women, and then of course do the video conference group with John at Pathways to Family Peace. And then I do a lot of a passionate issue of mine with Lisa is research on women's use of force. And so that's another area that I spend quite a bit of time on. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. John?
Hi, my name is John Heath, and I work for the Family Violence Project in Maine, and I'm the Director of Intervention and Prevention there. And I've worked for 14 years now doing work with perpetrators, and I also work on the Domestic Violence Helpline as a trained advocate for Family Violence Project.
Thank you so much. Rebecca? Oh, we cannot hear you.
Oh, we can't hear you, Rebecca. I think you're muted. Now, Zipha, can you see if she...
She doesn't show up as muted on my end.
Yeah, she doesn't.
It must be your phone, your actual phone.
Oh, you know what? It says that you didn't enter the PIN, Rebecca. It says you need to enter the PIN. I'm gonna...
Okay.
I don't know if
So,
that will matter, but
while you figure that out, I know Rebecca, and I'm able to introduce her. Rebecca Thomforde Hauser. She works for the Center for Court Innovation, and right now, actually, the center is leading in partnership with Futures Without Violence and other programs the technical assistance of the Office on Violence Against Women for veteran intervention programs. So and I'm sure Rebecca will talk more about that. We are available to provide technical assistance to programs. Lisa?
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Young-Larance. I'm a practitioner and a researcher. I'm currently at University of Michigan as an instructor and a doctoral candidate. But I've created a number of community-based and one prison-based program for women who've used force, and then provide consultation on both program development, running programs, and then the unintended consequences of having court-ordered programming for women. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And very, very important to have your voice too here, Lisa, and all of you. So next slide, please. I think Melissa has talked about some of this. The word draft is big here. This is a living document. So it's very important that we all understand that these are considerations. We decided to change the name to considerations rather than recommendations because in truth, we don't have enough knowledge to have best practices for this kind of situation. It's new for all of us, right? It's an adaptation of the guidelines that, as Melissa said, the European network put forward, and we're grateful for that leadership. We are open to getting your input and comments, and that can be included as footnotes in the draft. So don't be shy to let us know what you think and what you are experiencing yourself. And the actual draft document will be released later today.
I think Rebecca's back on, Juan Carlos. She's just sent me a text saying, I think.
Okay. Can we hear you now, Rebecca?
Can you hear me now or no?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Would you like to say anything
So I'm
else?
Rebecca from the Center. Sure. Just wanted to say hi. I'm from the Center for Court Innovation, also living in a rural area in Vermont and having technical difficulties. So glad to be here.
Well, that is part of the reality that we're facing right now, right? The inequity on internet access and internet speed is really affecting the work. So this is a real life example here. So I actually going to pass it on to you, Rebecca, to do the next couple of slides.
Sure. So I think, you know, one of the things that we are trying to deal with right now is a pandemic within a pandemic in some ways, that domestic violence, not only anecdotally, but statistics from different states are showing domestic violence is either on the rise or continues to be one of the primary calls that police are going out for. And so I think trying to respond in the same way that we have isn't going to work. You know, even if all of our technology was perfect, we're all operating and experiencing this crisis in a different way. And so thinking about how to support men who or women who are in our programs in a way that is responsive to the reality of the trauma and stress that we're all feeling and that they may be feeling and experiencing in their community around this issue. And what we heard from many providers is that, you know, the men in their group, either all of them know someone who has COVID-19 or has died from it already. We know that this is impacting marginalized communities in a disproportionate way. And so really thinking about that, the context within which we're providing these programs is important. Again, I think, you know, really at the core of all of our work continues to be creating safer communities, safer relationships, and safer lives for those victim survivors and their children. And so I think, you know, when we're thinking about this safety for survivors in the context of COVID, that's going to look very different in every community. And so the importance of continuing to partner with those community-based victim advocates. If you already have that relationship, if you don't have that relationship, now's the time to, you know, pick up the phone and call them because they are going to have the best sense of what the safety concerns are for the victim survivors in your community, and really help you think about that context.
And I don't think we can emphasize that enough, Rebecca. This is not the time of the Lone Ranger. If you are a Lone Ranger, you know, in my humble opinion, I don't think there should be Lone Rangers in general. But right now, it's absolutely critical that if you don't have a CCR in your community, I mean, obviously it's not the time to organize a full-fledged CCR. Maybe after this passes, you will realize why it's so important. But to, as Rebecca said, to be in contact with your advocates, to let them know what you're doing, to get their feedback is absolutely critical. And what we are hearing around the country is that advocates are eager to do that. They are super busy too, and this is an unfunded addition to their work. But by and large, I think advocates are very open to giving feedback in these cases.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, you know, when we're thinking about the context in which this is happening and asking some of the questions, maybe it's on the prior slide. Yeah, there we go. You know, so our office is based in New York City, and, you know, what we're finding there is that while in New York City, you know, police, it's like 1 in 6 police officers has COVID-19 right now. There's just the trauma and stress of that reality. And so calls to police, I think, are down. Arrests in New York City are down. And so really thinking about what is happening with those first responders in your community. Are you at the epicenter right now? Is who's being impacted in your community? That's going to really impact the way your coordinated community response is working, and inform kind of how you can go about providing ongoing support for the men in your groups. You know, courts are doing all different things around the country. Some have already been up and running for many years doing things electronically. So this change that's not one of the stressors. You know, there's many stressors, but that's the thing that's stressing them out. For many courts, this will be the first time they're using Zoom or something to do hearings, and that's a huge stressor. And I think when we're, you know, everybody, each agency is getting different types of mandates from on high, and so it's changing every day for judges as to what they can and cannot do. And so I think it's so important to continue those relationships, checking in on a regular basis to see, okay, what's happening, who's doing what, so that you can do your programming in the greater context of what's happening in the community.
Thank you. I think we covered that, so
Yep.
next one.
Okay.
It's important to emphasize too that this guide at this point is intended for work with male perpetrators of violence. And also, we know that many of you work with female women who have been accused of using violence. So I will invite Lisa to talk a little bit about that context.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. So as Juan Carlos stated, as we go through these slides, the primary function is to provide ideas and discussion on addressing men's coercively controlling and battering behavior in perpetrator-focused groups. But recognize that groups for women, and when I'm saying women, I'm referring most typically in my work is cisgender heterosexual women, but also recognizing that in same-sex relationships that violence can and does happen, and the role of homophobia in those relationships and shaping both what's happening and can be tailored to the pandemic, and then what can then be a domino effect on how practitioners are responding to that. But in looking at our slide that we have here and thinking of safety and context as number one, listening to her, listening to how her relationship-specific context is impacted by really the gendered nature of coercive control, and with the dominant, most of the groups serving heterosexual women here, looking at how that can be tailored to further abuse her in a way that is very cleverly masked. So if we're thinking of, which we'll be going through later on, but as we're having conversations of the nature of contact, what video conferencing can do in terms of a coercively controlling partner can put people at risk, regardless of what their sexual identity is in that relationship. I've already heard reports of the truly coercively controlling partner putting a woman who's in a women use of force group, threatening her that if she doesn't allow him to shelter at home, with her and their child in common, then he'll make false allegations about her and threaten custody agreements. So things are happening, things are evolving and changing every day. So really listening, looking out for the unusual nature of things that can be happening, and being able to be a voice, an institutional voice, not only in our contact with them, but in our contact with referring agencies, and in how we're documenting every contact, making sure that we're being behaviorally focused rather than not categorizing folks. So it becomes clear in the weeks, months, and years later what we were talking about at that time. And I'm happy to answer questions as we go forward, but we just wanted to bring it to your attention that although this guide is focused on men, that we need to be thinking of the safety considerations of women, because as we know, women and women's use of force programs typically have survivorship histories of both domestic and sexual violence, and that adds an additional component to their experience.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Yes.
Next one, please.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to point out also that, and this is how the considerations are organized, that there's more than one option to do this kind of work, right? I think a lot of people were trying to translate what they do normally into this new reality, and the truth is that it's not translatable, or at least fully translatable. And some of the things that we have considered best practices might not apply right now. And that's what is so challenging right now. So for instance, I think most of us hopefully will agree, and there's research to back this up, that group modalities for this work are preferable in general, in normal circumstances, than individual, right? However, we are hearing from some programs that what they are able to do right now is individual work. So depending on what you're thinking about, you could be doing individual work for crisis management, and we'll say a little bit more about that, or actual behavior change programming, which of course would be more challenging in that context. And likewise, you could be thinking of doing work process via video or phone, either for crisis management or what we're calling adapted behavior change. And an important note about this is that we are hearing from people across the country that right now a lot of people are focusing in crisis management. In some way, the whole country is in crisis. We all are experiencing a level of stress, right? All of us, that we are not used to. And of course, that will be translated to the folks who use these programs. So a lot of folks are telling us, we are forgetting about the actual pedagogical part of more formal pedagogical part of the lesson, and we are providing a space or holding a space or checking on folks to see how they are doing right now at this moment. And of course, this is something that I can't change day to day with folks, right? So I think those considerations are very important. We will talk a little bit more about that, but we also want to put out there that a third option would be to suspend services, right? It's not ideal. Obviously, we need these services more than ever right now, but depending on circumstances, again, many programs, maybe they are not connected either to their community, to advocates, to the men in the program might decide that this is not workable. There's economic and financial considerations that we will also talk about a little bit more. But again, I think it's so important to consider that right now, learning new things for all of us is probably very challenging, and that applies to children. I know probably many of you are now playing the role of both professionals and teachers to your children. Mine are grown, thank God, at this point. But I think John was mentioning yesterday that in Maine, for instance, they have decided that there will be no new material, just review of previous material for children. So it's an interesting lesson to get, because I think it is unrealistic that we will go forward as we were doing before. Now let's talk a little bit about about a very important topic, which is risk assessment. And I'll pass it to Rebecca first to make some comments about this.
Hi. Am I unmuted? Can you hear me still?
Yes.
Yeah.
No?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. Okay. So I think with risk assessment, it really, again, is important to think about the context in which this is happening and what's happening in your larger coordinated community response. There may be people in your community already.
Hold on 1 second, Rebecca. Somebody is clicked in and they're not muted. Okay. Okay, go ahead, Rebecca. Sorry about that.
I think I'll just sound like a broken record throughout this thing. I really think thinking about the context in which risk assessment is already happening in your community, and that ongoing partnership with victim advocates who may already have established a relationship with the victim and done some kind of lethality assessment already. I would say that maybe if you're a program that has never done a risk assessment, doesn't have risk or lethality factors as part of your comprehensive intake, now might not be the time to just start doing a risk assessment, but it may be time to reach out to your other partners who have that information. I was just emailing with some folks out in Colorado. They probably have one of the country's most robust systems for assessing risk and then putting people into programming. And right now, even they have said, they've had to have like a 30-day semi-lift of their standards that require that comprehensive risk assessment, because they understand that might not be able to happen over the phone or via a Zoom or a Skype type of situation. And so what they're suggesting is that you do as much of a risk assessment as you can and mark in that assessment where you have not been able to capture that information. But again, I would think, it could be a good time if you're in risk and lethality to reach out to Melissa or to any of us here. We have resources. We could, do some substantive training around DV risk and lethality. It might be a good time to brush up on that, but it's definitely a good time to reach out to your community partners and see, what kind of information they could safely and ethically give you. And then the second part is to think about how that's going to inform what you are doing and what type of decision making you might be having around individual classes, drop-in sessions, group sessions, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Rebecca. Melissa, tell us a little bit about your experience with this. Oh, there's an echo.
Yeah, so maybe when Lisa and Rebecca, when we're not talking, we'll mute because there's just a little bit feedback on one of us. But one of the things for us is that our risk assessment, so, we're outside of Duluth, we're in northeastern Minnesota. So we're not in Duluth, we're in the rural Duluth, but we're a part of the same county. And so the way that risk assessment happens here is that there's a domestic violence response team that does that. And then they give the results to us. So we don't do risk assessment. So for us, I'm relying on probation, and probation is still operating in our community. They're actually doing fairly well considering what's happening. And so they're continuing to do that. And they figured out a way to still share all the information to do the domestic violence response team assessments. And I remember when John and I started this back in January 2019, and we started getting our first referrals because all the men are from Minnesota, even though John's in Maine facilitating. And I said, John, we got our first couple referrals. I'll send that information to you. And I remember John saying, you get all this, on a guys. And I said, yeah, this is, standard what we get. So we get all the police reports, we get their probations, their PSI, their pre-sentence investigation, we get a copy of the risk assessment, we get any, contact, victim contact that they've had. So, the stack of information that we get is well coordinated and quite a bit. And part of it for me is that, you don't know what other people are getting until you talk to other people, right? So when Jen and I started doing this group, that's when I sort of realized that in part, but also from doing some training with people. But I do think, to what Rebecca was saying, is that coordinated community responses are going to have a real challenge at this point of being able to share information in many regards. And, a big part of doing risk assessment is not just in what the people tell you, but what the information you have in your system, right? That about, previous data that's kind of sitting in the system. So it's a question of, can you get that information? And then also to what Rebecca was saying about thinking about some of these risk factors. When we send you the document later today, you will see that part of what we've done is to say that none of the risk factors have changed, right, in the US, that there's quite a bit of empirical data. In fact, the US, Australia, the UK have, we've spent quite a bit of time on this. But what's changed is, how people are living, what their social world is, just like ours has changed. So in part, it's for us to know about, to refresh, like Rebecca said, our memory about what all those risk factors are, coupled with the way in which people are living now, how much access they have to each other, sort of at this time.
Thank you.
May I chime in? This is Lisa. I'd like to chime in with that. And just again, I will become a broken record throughout our time together today. But I want to remind us that in the cases of women with domestic and sexual violence histories who are mandated to services, the best tried and true risk assessment is listening to her and what's going on and how that is changing with each and every contact. Because even though they may not be living together now, even though she and her family may not be COVID-19 exposed or have it, that can change in any particular moment in time. And so continuing to go a step further and doing the risk with each contact, but in a way that, because the best possible tool in the world can't adequately capture what she's going through in this unprecedented moment.
Absolutely. John, do you want to tell us a little bit, when you don't have the catalog version that Melissa has, what do you do?
Sure. So, So for us, it's really about getting in contact with referral agents and having conversations in real life and giving them feedback based on another part of, I think, risk assessment is something that we do every week, and all of us do, is just the sort of check-in and getting a pulse on where someone is at. And I feel like that's something that's going to continue even during this. And there'll be times when we'll see a guy on video conference or on the phone, and we'll say, "Wow, there's something, I just don't feel right about this. I need to contact, an advocate, or I need to contact probation or a referral agent and just sort of step this up the same way that we would do in a regular class setting." So I feel like that's really an important consideration too.
Thank you, John. But I think that's very important, because there's the formal risk assessments and tools and so on. And I see in the chat box that some people are asking for that, as well as maybe some training. So we will take that into consideration for future webinars and trainings and so on. And then there's the informal, like, as you say, week to week. And these days, I know you cannot have day to day, but that's what's happening, right? I mean, I certainly personally, I live in New York City. I have days that I'm doing pretty well, like today, and days that I'm struggling, right, emotionally. So we're all in that same boat, and it's so important right now to be paying attention to that, and to get acquainted to, even if you don't, as Rebecca said, if you haven't implemented formal risk assessment right now, just get acquainted with what are some of the risk factors that there are, right? If you are not familiar with them, so that you can pay attention in a more informal way. So Melissa, why don't you tell us a little bit about the criteria for deciding how to what method of delivery of services people can choose?
Yeah, so this goes back to what Juan Carlos was talking about before when he was talking about individual, group. Are they going to be crisis? Are they going to be adapted? So there's a few key pieces here that we wanted to talk with you about. And one of those is about voluntary participation. And what we mean by that is, in part, is that for those of you who are reaching out with men to try to figure out what you're going to do, that we encourage you to make it voluntary based on what you're providing. The only caveat to that, I would say, is that if you have someone who you have great concern about and are considered high risk, that that you not, that we're not saying make them, but use some of your skills to try and see if you can stay in touch with them. But overall, we would say is have it be voluntary, and the reason for that is that because the capacity for people to be able to participate at this time is going to be wide and varied. Do people have, even cell phones? When I did some interviews this last weekend with advocates, one advocate brought up, she's an advocate who lives in a Native American community, and she said, Melissa, I can tell you that most of the men who are going to the programs here have straight talk phones, which are ones where, the phone number changes often. Their ability to stay connected with you is going to be a challenge. Their ability to have a computer or a tablet or internet connection. So that also goes to capacity to participate, which is the second one. So the first two are really linked together because people's capacity in many regards is going to be limited. We're saying also consider it to be voluntary, because the other thing about capacity and also people's current situation is where they live right now or where they're staying, right? Because for I know when I was talking to Liberty for Center for Court Innovation, one of the things she said, which I thought was really helpful, is to not just ask people, where do you live, but where are you staying? Because where people formally have an address and where they may be staying at this time might be different, right? And so part of like looking at where people live and where they're staying is, do they have the capacity to have some level of privacy to talk to you in? And so that's really, really important, is to be able to have some level of that. So that it's at least away from the victims and at least away from the children who may be in the home. I don't know about you, but I have 2 teenagers and I'm with them a lot at this point. I have the luxury though of having a home that has 2 levels. I'm making them stay upstairs, right? And I know that that's a privilege that I have. A lot of people live in very small, homes, and even if there is a wall, you could hear everything through it, right? And so thinking about also people's ability to participate if they live alone, if they live with the person that they cause harm to, or if they have a new partner. And then the next is the level of risk for lethality and then dangerousness. We're looking at risk for lethality in particular at this. So that's where we're saying that we're going to encourage perpetrator programs to at least have some contact with those who are even prior to COVID, so we sort of say pre-COVID-19, if they were considered a high risk, that we'd encourage you to find a way just to stay in contact with them to see what, to be a resource to them. Then the other thing is what options a perpetrator program can provide. Some perpetrator programs don't even have the capacity to do all these things we're talking about. They take money, they take staff, they take computers, they take really good internet. I was on the phone, with a program in a very rural part of the state, and they just said, the only really good internet available is satellite, and that's really expensive. So I don't even have the capacity to do the groups that you're talking about. So it's also about what the perpetrator program has in terms of capacity. And then the last is kind of what Juan Carlos was talking about in the beginning, which is what's the current crisis level for COVID-19 in your community or state? And talking to my colleagues and friends in New York is a really good sort of example for me coming from rural Minnesota. I see a lot here in rural Minnesota of people who aren't taking it as serious as I would hope they would. We are in a state that also is in a lockdown situation right now. We're not one that has a fine if you don't do it, because our governor said he trusts us to follow the rules. And for the most part, people are, and they've interestingly enough here tracked that by cell phone data, that people are not moving a lot, that people are staying in place. So just, people are tracking you. That's one of the lessons too I've learned through this. But
Yeah.
also that, the situation when I talked to my friend Juan Carlos, living in, New York City, and every time I talk to him, I hear an ambulance siren in the background. I'm not
Yes.
hearing that here, right? We don't have the number of deaths, but what I do know is I'm paying attention here in Minnesota that the governor came on Monday here and said that they expect our peak of crisis to come in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So the other thing to consider is that right now, what we're providing is an adapted level of group through video conference. But we've told the men that at a certain point, that if their experience changes and our experience changes as facilitators, that we may stop that or we may change that. So part of what we're saying also is to keep a tab on where the level of crisis is in terms of COVID-19, in terms of your community or state.
Right. And again, the adaptability of the work is essential because things are changing day to day, week to week, right? So what might be appropriate right now might not be appropriate a month from now. We don't even know where we'll be there, right? Very interesting. One thing that I want to add to this is that from my perspective, an interesting thing, and we'll talk a little bit at the end of this, this is helping us break some paradigms that we have had in this country about this work, in my opinion. One is that men who use violence will not seek services voluntarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that they wouldn't want to ask for help. I hear that the DV hotline is fielding an increased number of calls from folks who use violence. And while we still need, of course, a systemic response, I think this is teaching us that we can have a community and a relational response. And the programs who have been practicing that kind of response, we hear that they might have upwards of 80 or 90% of the men in their programs participating in the groups presently, if they have the capacity. So I feel that that's, in some way, there's an interesting opportunity here too. Let's see, next one, please.
Juan Carlos, before we move to the next one, I'd like to add just another thought in terms of capacity and how we think of capacity to participate, and to recognize that people with substance misuse issues, challenges, no matter how they identify, that those issues, as we know, are likely to be magnified in times of crisis. And so being able to provide extended resources to them in whatever innovative ways it is that we think that we can do. So thinking about that.
Thank you, Lisa. And as you probably know, the substance abuse field is kind of having to struggle with the same issues, right, that we are right now, and trying to be adapted in the same way. So now we would like to talk about the different options. Once you have decided what your program can do, we have a series of options in the considerations. Some of them are individual, as we said at the beginning. Some of them are group, and then there's the issue of partner support, which in my opinion has to be central for every program in whatever way that you do it, but we will consider how to do that. So I will not read all the titles right now because we will cover each one of this next. So why don't we go to the first one, which is individual weekly support
So one thing,
via
Juan Carlos,
phone.
I just want to say, if that's
Yes,
okay,
go ahead.
just to give credit to the European network, because really that this base work really came from them. When you see the double letters, that's how we adapted it a bit, because there's a bit more going on here. But I just want to make sure to give our colleagues in the European network sort of the credit for this. For those of you who were listening last week, you would have seen A, B, C, and D, but we've adapted that for the US context.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Rebecca, you want to start us out with this one?
Unmuted.
Sure. So I think, what we've been hearing from programs around the country, they have been doing this approach of really doing kind of crisis management via the phone with the people in their group. They're trying to do that at least once a week. Some folks have set up like a WhatsApp chat group or doing it via text. They're really trying to engage with the men in their group to just touch base, like what's going on for you? Have you lost your job? You know, getting those kind of things that may be those risk factors, which we talked about, but really helping to understand what's happening for this person immediately, so that they can then figure out how to best support that person. And one of our partners on one of our national grants out in Milwaukee that's being hit really hard by this virus right now, you know, they're trying to set up maybe a hotline and so that those people who've caused harm, the perpetrators, could call in that hotline. They're also reached out to their defense bar to, you know, if someone's arrested, let's get them, you know, can we do an individual meeting with them right away? Can we hook them up voluntarily to do this while their case is pending, so that we can engage them, you know, while they're waiting until the end of May or June for their case to be heard.
And thank you for mentioning WhatsApp. Brian Jones said that it's an idea he had not considered. So even as we move to, I hear an echo. Do you folks hear it?
Yes.
Okay. Even if as we move to these platforms, and this is something that is not part of this webinar, but the technology part of it, right? A lot of people are doing Zoom. Some people are concerned about the security issues with Zoom, but there's other possibilities, right? Besides Zoom and in certain communities, for instance, in immigrant communities, WhatsApp is the most common way to communicate. So they are very, very, very used to that. So that's a good example. I just want to make one more comment about this, which is that in some way my admiration for the Alma Center, which is considering this hotline, and I know other people have been thinking about this. You know, we know that you folks are under incredible stress. All programs are. We know that funding is very scant for if at all available for programs, and people are working around the clock. And the commitment that I've seen in programs right now, it's humbling, really, in trying to do the work. And this idea of having a hotline, I mean, you know, the resources that it takes, right, to have a 24-hour hotline are undescribable in some way, and yet people are considering that. And I think, again, this is an opportunity in the long run, policy-wise, to consider some of the things that needed to be in place and are not, and maybe can be in the future. So let's move next to individual weekly contact via phone for adaptive behavior change. John can, and Lisa, by the way, if you want to add anything at any point, please let us know.
Sure.
John?
So yes, so this was our sort of adaptation for U.S. work, given that a lot of the men are referred by probation, and there's sort of sentencing guidelines around the work that they need to do. So this would be about like adapting curriculum that's currently in place so that it fits into, you know, either like a telephonic meeting with men weekly or more frequently. This would be sort of preparing like you normally would for a class, and having a topic, an idea in mind on how you're going to engage with the perpetrator. I think that the most important consideration that we want people to really think about is not focusing on sort of the person's violence or accountability during this time. We want to really work to make this a partnership, focusing on strengths, not focusing on topics that are going to get somebody upset, given the fact that they're probably home with family members, and that would, I think, add to victim safety concerns. For instance, using Duluth, oh, sorry, did someone have a comment?
No, go ahead, Jen.
Okay, the Duluth curriculum is really helpful in the fact that there's the equality wheel. So half the program or more is focused on equality-based topics, partnership, negotiation and fairness, responsible parenting, trust and support, respect. Those types of things. Generally in classes, we don't see anyone sort of feeling attacked or challenged or put upon. They're really sort of focusing on their lived experience with each of these topics. How have they done this well? And so that sort of inspiring work, I feel like, is going to be important during this time where a perpetrator may be home with family and children.
Thank you, John. And we already are having a very interesting conversation here in the chat box. I hope that people can follow it. Great comment from Lisa Nitsch from House of Ruth in Baltimore that, again, this is an opportunity to partner with your local victim service organizations, which many have already hotlines. So, and I know House of Ruth works both with survivors and people who use violence. Can we go to the next one, which is about intensive individual support for crisis management? So if you have already risk assessments in place and you know your group members, you will know that some of them are higher risk. In this case, some programs are doing more frequent contact with, again, it has to do with capacity, but that's what would be recommended, because as we know, it's kind of like a day-to-day kind of thing. This would be another good place to have a 24-hour access, but we understand that would be very difficult. But some programs are choosing to do more frequent individual check-ins. Rebecca, anything to add here?
No, I don't have anything more to add. I think this is where it would be really important too to collaborate with your victim advocates. If you're doing additional, work with folks, you're going to be wanting to check in with those advocates, or some organizations have like a victim liaison whose job it is to reach out to the partner while someone's in a program. But thinking through those things, because if someone is higher risk, that can be we know it's a dynamic changing factor. And again, I think all of these things can be fluid. I think Melissa brought that point up well. If you're not in a crisis hotspot right now, it is a good time to think about, do you have the capacity to do any of these things, 2 of them, 3 of them, and kind of plan for them. Like the Alma Center planned ahead and had classes on Google Classroom set up, and then they realized, right now they can only be doing like A and AA and B or whatever. At some point they might be able to do substantive things. So I think thinking fluidly about what, your capacity may change over time to do A or B or C.
Lisa, do you have anything to add at this point?
I do, in terms of, well, to add to what Rebecca was saying, so whatever services are happening for women, for example, not just one size fits all next step. For example, although we're encouraging people to consider not doing video conferencing for women, given the risks and that it has not been done before. And I know video conferencing is coming up next, but when we're thinking of melding these things together for established groups, what that looks like in terms of individual contact for crisis support for the time being, as all of us are saying that this changes and it's very place specific, and then being able to have that fluid response in terms of what's working at what point in time. What will that look like?
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. The other thing I just say is that in the written document we're going to provide for you, there are some sample questions and things to think about to plan for each of these. So we didn't want to spend our time on that right now. We want to present sort of all these different options, but just know in the guide there are some examples of some things.
Thank you. Next one, please. It's back to you, John.
Sure, yeah. So for the more intensive individual contact, this would be sort of in addition to the adaptive classes that you may be having, you may identify with, as your coordinated community response, you may identify a person who's at higher risk at this time. And so this person may need some extra phone calls during the week. And the other sort of thought that I was having around this sort of intervention is, I think it's really important to consider impact to victim in sort of unintended consequential ways. For instance, I know a lot of us are really sort of like concrete around appointments, and so my recommendation is that if you have an appointment with somebody for a phone call and maybe they don't answer, to consider that there could be something going on in the home. And if, for instance, that's considered an absence, how is that going to impact the victim who may have contributed to why this person couldn't answer the phone at the time? So I think those things are going to be really important to consider as we move forward with this.
Thank you, John. So let's move now to then group video conferencing, because it seems like a lot of people are doing that. I can see it in the chat. I have heard from folks. And again, we want to make sure that people are, at the same time, we're trying to adapt, are being very thoughtful about this. And as you know, Melissa and John had a little experience around this, not during COVID-19, so it's a little different, but at least there are some interesting lessons learned. One thing that we heard, for instance, from a program in Kansas is that having two facilitators in the video calls is really important, that they had tried because of resources to go to a one facilitator model, but there was, for instance, in one group, a person who was in crisis, and they were able to take care of that person as it would happen in a real group. So I think that still applies, and I'm sure that a male-female model still applies too. One thing that we heard, and this is from Men Stopping Violence in Atlanta, is the idea of drop-in groups in addition to the regular groups. So as John said, I think our rules that often are very rigid for a good reason and are part of accountability might need to be a little more flexible right now. We just don't know, and it could be an emergency, or it could be, that your kid needs something at this point and you didn't hear the phone, or it could be so many things right now. So one idea that I think is very interesting from Stopping Violence is this idea of opening just a space for anyone from any group, not in a particular cohort of group, to come and share. And apparently people have been using it, and apparently participants who had finished the program even years prior, because they made it open and available, are coming back for support too. And even people who haven't been in groups, which it's maybe a different conversation. This is one that Men Stopping Violence and other programs have some experience with in terms of integrating members of the community. But I thought that was a really interesting experience. They are doing it 3 times a week, I understand. Rebecca, what would you like to add to this?
No, just to that point, they advertise that via social media, Twitter, put it on their website. And my understanding is that they've had men who haven't even ever been in groups coming into those drop-in calls, or they had someone call in who had been out of group, for quite a few years, and saw that this was happening, was living in another state, and called in. So again, I think thinking about the different ways to offer support, and I obviously this is a moving thing, so there's no research to prove this, but I think if programs can provide this kind of drop-in support, then they may be able to move to behavior change supportive groups, because they're doing both things at once, and there might be a way to delineate, like, here's where we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z, and here's where we're going to talk about other things, and help kind of clarify some of those lines. So.
Right. And I think an important point to make here is that these options are not exclusive of each other. In fact, and I know it's a matter of resources, but a combination of these different options, as Rebecca pointed out, could be ideal, you know, but also of the group format and the individual format. And, you know, I hope as a best practice that many of you, when you were doing groups in person, if you detected that there was a problem with someone, either high risk or if they were going through something difficult, that you would either meet individually afterwards or reach out by phone. So we have that still applies, and even more so right now, right? So Melissa, tell us a little bit more about the next slide, please.
Yeah, so when we, John and I, as we said, started doing this in January 2019, and so we haven't stopped, so we're still doing it through till now. And so there's a number of things that we've sort of learned about doing groups this way. There's a one of which is that you really do need two facilitators, and you need to adapt your curriculum and what you do. And so in particular, John mentioned that we're staying on the equality side and the nurturing of children side, but also there's a whole bunch of things you do in in-person group that you just can't do here. And one thing that we learned very quickly that's a disadvantage is some of the videos. Some of the technologies don't show the videos sort of seamlessly. The audio you can pick up. So sometimes, like just give an example, John and I did group yesterday, is we ended group early and then we emailed them a link to a video. In fact, it was the one, Juan Carlos, the one that you gave us so many years ago, that something my father would do. We sent them the link to that. So we ended group early. They're going to watch that on their own. And then the way that we know they watched it is they have to email us their reflections, or they can send an audio text of the reflection. And all the men were in our group happen to have the capacity to do that. So we already knew that. So that's something that they're able to do with us, but in terms of adapting. One of the good things, advantages of facilitating groups this way is the chat box, is that, you know, you don't have a chat box for in person. You know, it'd be really weird if in person I was like whispering to John, you know, like in the middle, but we say we get to do our whispers in the chat box, and the men don't know, right, that we're sort of doing this in this way. So we're able to talk to each other. The other thing that we found is that we always end group with a reflective question for the men to think about. And we send that to them via email. And the other thing is that we're just using right now Microsoft Word. So we capture everything that's sort of said and all sort of the main points and the thinking. And then we turn that into a PDF. And then we email that to the men at the end of every session. And the men have actually found that really helpful. And so the one thing that's been a benefit of doing it this way is that we've had a lot more contact with the men in between each group, either by text, by phone, or by email. Where you know, I've done in-person groups now for 20 years. And and so anyway, having done those for 20 years, in that way, you know, I haven't had as much contact with men sort of in between groups. So I've seen more contact with men in between groups in this sort of format. But as I had mentioned before, is that we're gonna adjust group, you know, as time goes on. And so, you know, as the crisis sort of increases, but what we're doing at the beginning of every group, as John said, is we're asking the men, we have a quick little check-in questions that we'll provide those to you in the document about, you know, how has COVID affected your life? And we have seen an increase, I would say, in terms of the stress level. Just to give an example, is one guy said this week, he said, you know, I'm an essential worker, my wife's an essential worker, and we have a 12-year-old son at home, and none of us know 12-year-old math. And he's home alone all day, and he's supposed to be doing his homework, but he doesn't. But we come home, we're tired, and we're fighting and arguing a lot about 12-year 6th grade math, right? And so, you know, we can see it in him when, you know, and I'm dealing with 8th grade math, which I love algebra, but it's the 10th grade math I don't like, which makes me very frustrated, the geometry. So, right, so I totally get it. And the other thing that John and I, now there's a lot of debate about this amongst facilitators. So, and I also want you to know that we welcome people to observe.
Oh, we lost you, Melissa. We lost
We
you.
lost your audio.
Observe our groups. We've had observers observe our groups now for the last 15 months. Oh, did I lose me? Okay. Or did
You're
you
back.
okay.
It sounds
Sorry.
like it was
See, I think the
catching up.
kids got on the computer.
Oh,
Oh,
we lost
okay.
you again.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think
There you're back.
my daughter came down to get the other laptop to do her schoolwork.
Uh-oh.
Is it okay now?
I think so.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So, all right. So, anyways, just saying. So we're checking in with men at the beginning of every group about where they are in terms of their level of crisis. You know, in terms of this, and it's important for us to continually check with the men about that. But you know, as I was saying, my daughter just came downstairs to get the other laptop to do homework, so I'm sure she logged on and we have a glitch. So this is what happens, you know, in homes here. But we welcome observers to our groups as well.
Right.
Melissa, you mentioned the chat function, and just sort of like a caution to folks. When we first started doing this class a year ago, I wasn't that familiar with video conference technology, and I had intended to send Melissa a chat message that said, wow, he's really stuck in his belief system about women being illogical and not able to make good decisions. And that actually went out to everybody. So it was an interesting moment. The researcher was there and saw it. It was, you know.
Yes. Yeah, our researchers from the UK have observed 25 of our groups because we want them to really have a good sense of them. And so we're grateful they did that. But yeah, they happened to be there on that week when John sent the message to everyone. He could have said something worse, and John ended up taking responsibility for it. So that was good.
You folks have some good stories of your pilot and considerations.
Yes.
Maybe you can share them at some point.
Yeah.
One thing in terms of observation, again, this is something that I believe, and I think many of us do, that groups have to be transparent. I know there's a level of confidentiality that some people want to keep, but for me, this idea of opening the groups for someone to observe, to an advocate, to another person in the community that does this kind of work, it's a great opportunity really to make sure that we're doing the right things. So it's something that people should have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, did you have anything else to add at this point?
I'm muted at this point.
You're muted.
Oh, in there? Yes, not at this point.
Okay, thank you. So the next slide, I think we talked about the first point, that this is a time in which, yeah, you need to adapt to the reality, and individual sessions might be that reality. But the report or the considerations has some interesting questions, and I don't think there's an easy answer to these ones to take into account. One is, how are you going to give people credit or not without penalizing people who are not able to participate for whatever reason? And usually that will be people that are maybe more marginalized, more at a disadvantage, right? More economically challenged in some way. So that's an important consideration. What counts as credit? And someone had put in the chat box before that this is a conversation that you need to have with your court system, right? Too, it's not something that you can decide by yourself. But hopefully, if you have a good relationship with your justice system, this is an opportunity to be creative together and decide together what that means. Another one is whether you will charge or not. And we understand the reality of battery intervention programs. We understand that it's not sustainable for programs to run for months without charging for the groups, because most of them don't get outside support. And yet right now, someone had mentioned in one of our calls, Rebecca, that I think more than 50% of participants became unemployed basically overnight, right within a week time, and the realities are changing too. So it's another consideration. And then there's the issue of the documentation of participation, how you're going to document different modalities. I hear a little echo, but it might be Rebecca, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. Yeah, I think, when we had a drop-in call last week, it looks like, most people are saying that we'll give you credit even if you can't pay right now. If people are able to pay, they're still asking them to pay, but they're not, they're like marking them as like participating. They've kind of changed their standards around that kind of thing, because I think it is a moving thing. Many of the people have lost jobs, so they're doing it in different ways, and they're also reaching out. If folks are there as a court mandate or through probation, they're working with probation and the court to figure out, like, can this count, so that the person isn't then, in jeopardy of like violating, being on court watch for longer than they normally would be, or court supervision, or on probation. So they're working that out together with their victim advocates, probation, and the court, if it's a court referral.
Yeah, just to add to that, Rebecca, I think the other important thing is to think about is that, kind of back to what I was saying about people participating voluntarily, which is, will you get people to engage if they're not given credit? I think it's a legitimate question for people to think about as well. Our goal is to stay engaged with men. And so, at this time, because we think it is, I don't know if you mentioned Juan Carlos at the beginning, but like Minnesota, for example, 2/3 of the police calls have been domestic violence. That the police in Minnesota are able to respond, and the governor's asked police agencies to keep track and report to him. So knowing that 2/3 of the police calls are domestic violence and that it's increasing, we want to stay as engaged as much as possible. And so, it is a legitimate question about whether session credit is important. And here's the other thing I just want to say, there are a number of states I know who are on here who have much more extended lengths of time than Minnesota. So Minnesota requires by statute 40 hours, but there are states like Maine, like California, so there's like 52 weeks, 48 weeks. I think there's a real case to be made that, the empirical research, I've seen studies that say you get no more benefit from 12 weeks or 18 weeks from these groups, and some have said 24. So there's varying degrees, but there isn't data that has empirical research that has supported those higher numbers. So if you're in a state that has those higher numbers, in those states in particular, I'd really encourage you to give men credit for the time, because they are spending, quite a bit of time, spending a year's time with you, sort of, essentially. Where in Minnesota, it's 6 months. As an example. So it's, I would really have you sort of think about that as well. But the goal is to stay as engaged as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The other consideration is, as much as we would like to, as educators and activists and facilitators, adult learning research shows that people retain 10% of what we pass on. We would like 100%, right? But obviously people will retain certain things. So not covering every single point of your curriculum will not make a difference as much, as long as you are really working for the goal of reducing and ceasing the violence, right? Mm-hmm. I see that there's a great conversation, comments in the chat box. We probably won't have a lot of time for actual questions for our panelists, but I see that some of them are already engaging in this question. So please keep on doing that. And let's move on to the next slide and have Melissa and John talk a little bit about their experience.
Yeah, so we've covered a couple of these things, but just to add a couple of things, one of which is that the private and quiet space is important. we think, in terms of being able to engage with people. Having headphones and earbuds really makes a big difference. We require it because it provides confidentiality for the group members, right? So for example, my daughter just came down here about 10 minutes ago looking for the other laptop, right? If I was doing group right now, I don't want her hearing, what the men are saying. They don't want her overhearing it. So providing the headphones and the earbuds when you're at home is important, and because it provides some level of confidentiality. At the same time, we also have the observers. We allow for people to observe the group. And so just to say a couple things about addressing the unexpected, there are some sort of rules we've had to put in place that we just never thought we'd have to put in place. One of which is you have to have pants on, that you cannot be sitting in your underwear and just have a shirt on top, because inevitably your camera will move. So please, pants on, men in group. Who thought you'd ever have to require this, right? The other thing is that you cannot pick up your computer and go to the bathroom and set it on the side wall so we can all hear you urinate. Yes, we did have a man who did that in group early on. These are basic notions that one would think that you wouldn't have to tell adults, but those sorts of things, are sort of important. But the other thing that's happened, I'd say, is John and I've had a couple of guys who've lit up cigarettes, and smoked their cigarettes, like, who are we to say, right? Like, they're in their house. We've had other guys who've had their dog sit on their lap the whole time, and they just pet their dog, and we all love seeing their dog there. But there's also what we call sort of the portrait effect of these groups, which is that John and I have been doing groups for a long time in person. And for those of you who do those groups, that men can kind of hide, kind of lean back or have their head down, where here it would be really weird if I talked to you all with my head down like this, right? That would be weird. So the one thing I say is that it does keep people we found more engaged in that regard. But John, do you want to add anything?
Well, yeah, just that what we noticed was people developed more of quickly a comfort and a familiarity with each other in the video conference groups than either of us have ever noticed in an in-person group. So the men were interacting with us and with each other much sooner in ways that seemed even more with accountable language than we would have seen in an in-person group. So it was an unexpected surprise.
Yeah, then the last thing I'll just say about this is the size of the groups is that, because the video conference technology, we don't recommend that you have more than 10 men signed up at a time if you're doing a curriculum sort. Now, crisis management, we would open that up to bigger, but because if you have 10 on any given week, 8 will come, and 8 is kind of the magic number, we sort of think. You need more people than your facilitators. You need at least 3. So we would say that in terms of size.
Melissa and John, this is Lisa. May I add something quickly here?
Yeah, of course.
To provide context in terms of what one program I'm supervising is doing in the case of women. It's already an established group. They are not doing video conferencing because of the risks, whether or not the risks would be in these cases, partners returning or partners kind of in and out of the place where the women are staying. But they opted instead for a phone conference among the women, so their voices can be heard. They are a well-established group, and they were missing each other in the middle of all this social distancing. And so what they did first and foremost was come up with a group agreement in terms of what things can be going on or cannot be going on during the phone conference. So thinking in terms of, if somebody's smoking or not. This was more if somebody's making breakfast or kind of the background noise. So people were real upfront with what they were doing to keep that confidential group space, but also have some ground rules around that.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Lisa, because John and I actually have a guy right now who was using video conference, but because of COVID, he was using the library's internet and he can't use it anymore. So we're allowing him to participate via phone because he's been in group for such a long time. We wouldn't want to create a barrier for him to not be able to participate just because the library's closed because of this.
Beautiful. Thank you, Melissa. Rebecca, do you want to talk a little bit?
Can I this is Judy from Vermont, and I joined late, and I apologize. I was in another meeting. Are you going to speak to the pay and the credit?
Yeah, so we talked about that a little bit already, but we can talk about it now just again, which is to say that we're allowing credit, and then in terms of fees is that we are not we are being loose in terms of requiring people to pay at this time during this sort of phase because of the financial strain that people are under at this time. And so essentially what we're saying is that if you're going to get credit, at some point we tie credit and payment together. And so but we're allowing people to be delayed in their paying at this time because of the financial strain that people are under.
Thank you, Melissa. Rebecca, you want to talk a little bit about partner support?
Unmuted. Sure. So I think, as we've been saying throughout, I think, if you don't already have as part of your standards or your current practices a strong relationship with community-based victim advocates, now is the time to pick up the phone or shoot them an email. Many of the programs around the country already have either someone on staff whose job it is to reach out to victim advocates, like a victim liaison, something like that. I know Emerge has something like that, and Men Stopping Violence. Other folks have, I live in Vermont, so the standards there are that you have to have a relationship with the advocates, and they approve everything that you send out to a victim around information of the class. So I think now's the time to have those conversations, see what's happening from their perspective. If you are going to be doing any more outreach and sending information to victims about what's happening in class, talking about what that communication should look like and how it should happen with your advocates is important. And also figuring out, is there a way to safely share information that's, if a victim wants to tell you about something that's happening in the home right now, figuring out how to safely, how that information can be shared with you in a safe way, especially, when everybody's home at the same time. You don't want to just be calling up a victim and asking her a lot of questions when we know that their partner is in the same room or in the same apartment. So really thinking through those types of things, I think, is really important. And as Lisa mentioned in the chat box, victim advocates have been doing 24-hour hotlines since the beginning of the CCR response, and probably even before. So they may have a lot of strategies for you in how to engage in an ongoing way with the men in your program.
Thank you, Rebecca. And the other thing is that the advocacy field right now is doing an enormous amount of thinking around how to reach survivors, right? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. This is another very important point about making that contact that Rebecca mentioned. People are really thinking about this. Lisa, did you have anything to say about this?
No, thank you.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes left. Obviously, we won't have time for answering a lot of questions, or any at this point. But at the end, we are going to give, I think, Melissa and John, you're giving your email. And Rebecca, I know that you wrote the CCI technical assistance one before, but you might want to write it again for people. We will follow up, we will answer questions, we will continue to give support to the field. Melissa?
Yeah, so I just want to say at the end here, put this up. This is we're making an adaptation of this. It's kind of like, why are all these letters here, this A, B, C, D sort of thing. And so this is the European sort of flow chart, and we're adapting this for the US. My graphic skills are more minimal than the Europeans, apparently, so it's taking me a little longer to develop this. And so I stopped, and I'm talking to my graphic friend, but I just want to give you an idea. This is how it looks in the European version that we're going to sort of model ours after, and so we're very thankful for that. And then also, just Juan Carlos mentioned this early on, but one of the things Rebecca brought up yesterday during our prep call, which I thought was really sort of insightful, was about how this whole experience might change our work overall, and about how we work with men in our approach, and opportunities to engage with men who use violence in the broader community, not just court-ordered men. And one of the things I was sort of thinking about is, you know, there's sort of a whole broad base of people in terms of their approach in this work. You know, it's some things that people argue about sometimes and get in little fights about on, you know, listservs and at meetings and such. But the one thing I think is that this time is really pushing us, as Juan Carlos said, in paradigms which were not naturally oriented. And I think it could be one of the blessings that comes out from this in terms of our work. But Rebecca, this is sort of your thoughts. So do you want to just sort of add anything about this?
Yeah, I think you summed it up well. It's just, you know, often we are fractured in our thinking around, you know, we're either working on victim safety or we're working on offender accountability. And I think now more than ever, it's clear that the people in our group are more than people who caused harm. They're people who are experiencing trauma right now. They're people who are trying to be parents in the way that they never have, you know, and we think about the stress of our own lives, you know, Melissa, you're saying about doing geometry, you know, like we're all parenting more than we probably ever have before. And so I think, you know, looking at the people with whom we're working as full human beings, and figuring out ways that we can expand our way of engaging them to be accountable to themselves, to their partner, to their children, to their larger community, and how we can hold ourselves accountable to do the best that we can to help them get there along the way. And you know, I think that's really something that may be good that can come out of this.
Thank you, Rebecca. John, do you have anything? I saw that you wrote something really interesting about getting a loan from the Small Business Administration. I had not thought about that.
Yeah, so that, and actually our organization is doing that, and it's going to allow us to cover operating expenses for a couple months, which will allow us to really reduce our fees, if not eliminate them. So we're excited about that, and it's available. It's they want it. They want people to use it, and it turns into a grant if you don't lay anyone off. So
right. So it can be pardoned. So you can look at that. Lisa, any last words from you?
Thank you all for your commitment to this work, and we're all in this together. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to echo that. Thank you to everybody. The commitment of the field has been evident at this point for the 4 panelists here, for being leaders in the field when we desperately need that. So we'll continue to be in contact with all of you, and we will field your questions. And please take care of yourselves, be safe, and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. We will email you the document, and we will look at the chat box questions, and we will email some responses to you about those, because we're able to keep those, memorialize those, and give those to you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.